Good evening. My name is Judy Dittner, and on behalf of the Yale University Art Gallery, as the Richard Benson Assistant Curator of Photography and Digital Media, it is my pleasure to introduce Oliver Chanarin for his artist talk, The Heart is a Muscle. Oliver Chanarin, a Hayden visiting artist at the gallery, will discuss a series of works that examine the relationship between photographic technologies and power, made with his longtime collaborator, Adam Broomberg. Based in London and Berlin, Chanarin and Broomberg teach photography at the Hochschule für Bildende Kunst in Hamburg and at the Royal Academy of Art in The Hague. Tonight, Chanarin will also screen for us a new short film, The Bureaucracy of Angels, which looks at the destruction of 100 migrant boats in Sicily, the relics of asylum seekers caught in the Syrian migrant crisis. Two of their projects are featured in the exhibition, Before the Event, After the Fact, Contemporary Perspectives on War, currently on view upstairs in the 4th floor of the art gallery. For the project Chicago, they photographed a training site built by the Israeli army in the early 1980s on the Tzelim military base in the Negev desert. Broomberg and Chanarin's photographs document the artificial nature of this environment. Temporary elements such as cardboard walls and caricatured targets of enemy fighters exist alongside concrete blast walls and roads and alleyways that mimic the layouts of Palestinian towns. Another work on view, The Day Nobody Died, was made in Helmand Province in Afghanistan in 2008, while the artists were embedded with the British Army. Made by briefly exposing a rolled section of photographic paper to the sun to create an entirely abstract image, this powerful work challenges our expectations of war photography. I invite you all to view the exhibition after the talk. We're open till 8 o'clock tonight, and I hope you'll all join us afterwards for a reception in the lobby. Please join me now in welcoming Oliver Chanarin.
Thank you very much, Judy, and thank you so much for including us in your remarkable exhibition upstairs. It was really a pleasure to see it hung so perfectly. Yes, it's a remarkable show, and thank you also to Merlene for inviting me to be part of this program, and Liz for getting me here and helping me through a shitload of paperwork. Sorry. I'm going to start by showing a short film that's literally, we've just finished last week. It launched in King's Cross Station, which is one of the major railway stations in London. And it was a commission by Art on the Underground. So it's a public piece, and it was made to be exhibited in the station itself. So it's being seen right now on a huge screen as people are coming in and out of the Underground as they go from the London Underground to the Eurostar, which is where people pass through to get to mainland Europe, obviously. And the film, as Judy mentioned, deals with the migrant crisis in the Mediterranean. A very difficult subject to try to tackle, especially in a public work. But we felt like this was a great opportunity to make a work in a public space in the middle of London. This felt like a great platform for speaking about this issue, which is so interesting and so complex. And we wanted to somehow expand the biography of this crisis in a way, and show that it was something much more complex than the kind of knee-jerk reaction to migration and people coming, the normal stuff that people say about migrants. And we began by going on a boat with a rescue boat to the border of Libya in the Mediterranean and actually witnessing a rescue. So lots of boats full of people overladen being rescued and taken to the shores of Italy, where they were then taken into the asylum system. And then we began to film in one of the things that happens is people come on these boats across the Mediterranean and they become part of the asylum system, but the boats themselves never go back. And they've been accumulating in one port in Sicily for many years. And the Italian government finally decided that they just had to do something. And it wasn't a political thing, it was a logistical problem. There just wasn't any space for these boats anymore. But the boats, when you look at them, are exquisite objects. They're made of wood, they're hand-painted, they're kind of decorated with iconography, sailor's law, this eye, a bird with wings. They're really quite beautiful. And when you look at them, you think, well, this should actually be in the Met or the British Museum. This is like a Fang mask from West Africa. It's a reminder that it's not just people that are coming across the water, but also it's culture that's coming. And we wanted to somehow do something with these boats. We spent about a year getting access to this shipyard and then eventually permission to film the demolition of these 100 boats, which took a biblical 40 days. And it was interesting to watch, and actually I had no idea how they would demolish the boats until I got there, and actually I hadn't even thought about it. But you'll see that in the film. So I'll just show you this film and then we'll carry on afterwards. If you wouldn't mind just dimming the lights.
Cagrapivo l'occhio in terra da st'inverno, sti 20 anni di tormento con i cori sempre in guerra, notti e giorno. Terra che non senti, che non vuoi capire, che non dici niente, vedendomi morire. Terra che non tieni, oh, vuoi partire e non dici per farli tornare e chiangi che ha Nina e chiangi che ha terra che non senti, che non vuoi capire, che non dici niente, vedendomi morire. Terra che non tieni, oh, vuoi partire e non decidone per farli tornare e chiangi che ha Nina e chiangi che ha Nina. Maledetto tutti st'anni con i cori sempre in guerra, notti e giorno.
I'm just going to move straight on to the next thing. Bit of a strange film, no doubt. Still trying to work out what it's really about. But the next thing I want to show you is the first photograph that Adam and I took together, which was 20 years ago. And it's a portrait of a woman on a operating table in Guy's Hospital in London, just a big general hospital. And it's a photograph of somebody who's under anesthetic, a portrait. Sorry, a second. You know, we spent a lot of time getting permission to this hospital to take this portrait. We did a whole series of people under anesthetic, and we were interested in the idea of a portrait of somebody who was unable to compose themselves for the camera, because photography is so much about a kind of two-way relationship between the subject and the photographer, and sometimes the flow of power between the photographer and the subject is equal. Sometimes it's a bit unfair, and in this case it's entirely unfair, except that we did ask this woman for permission. And although we asked for permission, and although we got, you know, the right paperwork to be there, this photograph still felt transgressive in some way. It still felt that it was an invasion of somebody's privacy at a moment of unbelievable vulnerability. And one of the things we were really surprised by was the fact that in the 3 months that we were working there in the hospital, every single person that we interviewed and got permission to photograph said yes, which was just bizarre to us. It's crazy. And we couldn't work out why it was. And then we realized that because the hospital had asked us to dress up in doctors' kind of uniforms. So we were going around with like clipboards and doctors' stuff, and we had our camera as well. But the patients were mistaking us for somehow being part of this organization. And I think when you are unwell and you're in a hospital and you're feeling very vulnerable, you do give over a sense of authority to the institution. And that's exactly what had happened. And we realized that we were aligned with the institution. And although we didn't realize it then, if you look at our practice over the following 20 years, this was something that came back again and again, this concern about privacy, the idea of consent, the notion of the institution or the power of the institution in relationship to the individual. And these are things that have seemed to crop up a lot. At the beginning of our career together, working together, we were working very much in a classic documentary mode. We were working with a 5x4-inch plate camera, taking color negative film, and we were taking photographs in very exotic places like prisons. This is in South Africa, in Pollsmoor Prison. Prisoners are very photogenic. We were very interested in the sort of things the camera loves, these kind of images. It's very drawn. The history of photography is drawn to this subject matter, people in prison, incarcerated. This is Luis. He's in a mental institution in Cuba. We spent some time there photographing patients. And just as an aside, it was quite interesting. We were only allowed to photograph patients wearing shoes. So there weren't enough shoes going around, so the patients, if we wanted to photograph somebody, he had to get a pair of shoes, so he'd borrow somebody else's. So here we are working in this very traditional mode. Put up the camera, put it on a tripod, asking permission, trying to make a series of portraits. And this turned out to be a book called Ghetto, which analyzes 12 ghettoized communities around the world. We were in, as you saw, prison, psychiatric hospital, a military base where they train cosmonauts, quite depressed cosmonauts, as you can see. He actually never went to space, and many of them never do. So it's a bit sad. We were in a township that's in South Africa again. Adam and I are both South African, so we have a particular interest with the country. And then we came to take this picture really by chance. We were in Israel, and we were invited to Ramallah to photograph something or other. And we got an invitation to go to Arafat's compound. Arafat was at that time the leader of the PLO and arch enemy of Israel. And we took this picture, portrait of him, not a particularly good picture, I don't think. And a couple of months later, Arafat died. But so this might have been one of the last portraits of him. We packed up our stuff. We went back through to the airport in Jerusalem. And when we got there, the Israeli Defense Force already knew that we had been to his compound and that we had photographed him. And they took our film and they started to X-ray it. And it was quite clear that they were very intentionally trying to X-ray our film in a way to destroy it. So they put it, the boxes, these sheets of film, back and forth about 30 times. And they were grinning, you know, they were quite happy about it. And we got back to London, processed the film. And to our kind of horror, we discovered that there was this green mark across his chest. That was the result of, it's quite faint actually, but you know, it's there across his chest. It's just the X-ray machine writing onto the sheet of film. Now, it then dawned on us that actually that was much more interesting than the portrait, and that somehow this picture can be thought of as a collaboration with the Israeli Defense Force. They've actually helped us make the picture. Thank you, Israeli Defense Force. And so this collaborative work with the Israeli state, I think it suggests something really interesting about photography. It suggests the materiality, that this is a piece of plastic and it's been written on by light. It suggests a kind of abstraction. It talks about the medium of photography and the vulnerability of the medium to ideology in a way. And I'll explain that further as we go along. But it was really like a turning point for us. And we realized that we couldn't continue to just go around the world with our 5.4 camera taking nice portraits of people. That actually a camera is a piece of technology, and it's not neutral of ideology. It has our values kind of built into it somehow, and as does the film, as does the whole technology of image making, has the ideology of its day kind of built into its structure, and that really inspired us to do this next project, which is one of the works that's showing upstairs, The Day That Nobody Died. In 2008, we were embedded with the British Army. I'll just turn this down a little bit. We were embedded with the British Army, and we went to Helmand Province, which at that time was really the front line of the war against the Taliban in Afghanistan. And we were very interested in the notion of embedding, because embedding is a system for censoring the kind of images that are produced in war zones, and it's really clever. As a journalist, you're taken to the war zone by the military, and they give you access to the war, but in exchange, you give them access to you, and they control very carefully the kind of images that you can produce. There's a document that you can sign, that you have to sign, and I wish Liz was with me when I had to go through all that paperwork. But it's really, the contract is like a work of art in itself. It insists that you cannot photograph dead people or injured people. You cannot photograph the effect of enemy fire on any kind of vehicle or any building. You're not really allowed to photograph or document any trace of war, which is ironic, because that's what you're supposed to be doing there. And we thought a lot about how can we be embedded as journalists, but somehow push back against this system. And we realized that the only way to do it was to resist taking photographs at all. Because it really felt like the military was composing our photographs. They were telling us where to point our camera, and they were telling us when to click the shutter, and it didn't feel like we were, in that case, the authors of these pictures. So instead what we did was we took a box of paper. In the box is 50 meters of unexposed color film, Fuji film. And whenever we were in a situation where we would ordinarily be expected to take a photograph, we would instead unroll 6 meters of this paper and expose it briefly to the light, and then put it back in the box. And we actually turned a military vehicle into an apparatus for taking these pictures, a kind of dark room where we would close the lights of the door, unroll the paper, open the doors, expose the light and put it back. And our only kind of intervention there was to give each of these exposures a name. And the name referred to what was happening when we did the exposure. So on the first day that we were there, a translator for the BBC was executed by the Taliban in front of a group of British soldiers. And we made an exposure and we called it the Fixer's Execution. On the second day, something equally horrible happened, and each day we made these exposures and we titled the work in that way. And we had really no idea what these things would look like until we got back to the UK and we exposed the paper in the normal way. And I'll show you some details. There's not time for you to see the rest of that film, but essentially what the film shows you is the journey of the box from our studio to the front line and back. And as you can see from these details, what you get is traces of light, essentially. This is, I suppose, the essence of any photograph. It's just tracing a moment in time. It's just a bit of light writing on the paper. It's completely abstract, which, if you think about it, well, for the British military, that seemed very subversive to go to a war zone, to engage the army in this whole journey with the box. They even carried the box. They were, in a way, unwitting actors in this kind of Dadaist kind of performance, where they carried the box onto the vehicles, onto the helicopters, onto the aeroplanes. And what we came back with was nothing, essentially. I mean, just traces of light. It's a bit like scientists who go up to the North Pole and they drill down into the ice and they retrieve a piece of ice, and they can tell you that in medieval times there was this much oxygen in the air. It's a trace. For us, there's an example of them hung. So each of those, this one over here was the third one that we did. It's called The Day of 100 Dead, and it was the day that the 100th British soldier was killed. And I think these photographs are intended not as a kind of provocation, really, to the photojournalistic community, which is how they were received. But they just beg a question, I think, which is, what kind of image would be enough? What do we want to see from war? What would be sufficiently sad or ugly or violent to actually be a good picture of war? In fact, what is a good picture? So we're using abstraction here to turn the question onto the viewer. This is another project, and Adam and I have done quite a lot of work with archives. And following that work that we did in Afghanistan, we were invited to look at this really special collection of photographs that are in Belfast. And these are photographs that were recorded, that were made during the Troubles in Northern Ireland, during the 70s and 80s and early 90s. And what's particularly interesting about this archive is it was made by photojournalists who were living in Belfast at the time of the Troubles. And there was really a kind of tension there between those photographers that lived there in amongst the Troubles and those that were kind of parachuted in from the Guardian and the Wall Street Journal. And these guys were living and breathing this combat, this war. And at the same time, they were teaching photography to young students, young people and young adults. So they had a dark room and they had facilities, and they would do these workshops with the kids. And all of the pictures that the professionals were taking and all the pictures that the amateurs were taking somehow over time became muddled up, mixed up, as things do over time. And we were let loose on this archive. And why it was so interesting is that on one strip of film, you would see, a running battle with the British Army against the IRA. And at the end of that same clip of film, you would have kids running around, pulling their trousers down, doing moonies, and taking pictures of their girlfriends naked and that kind of thing. And we really loved this kind of confluence of the ordinary and the extraordinary. And the other thing we noticed was that all of the contact strips were marked with these stickers. The stickers were there to, they were frames that had been selected to be scanned, to be printed, or what have you. And over time, many of these stickers had been put down there. And we realized that the moment that that sticker had gone down on that contact sheet, it was actually obscuring a part of the picture, and that part of the picture hadn't been seen from that moment on. That the archivist had somehow unwittingly added to the picture by putting this dot. And our thought was, well, rather mischievously, we were, well, what's underneath that sticker? So we spent a long time going through this archive and thinking about these dots as a kind of musical score, as a kind of another way to write the history of the Troubles. And we made this little mask, which is the size of a CD, because that's how we cut it, around a CD. And we pulled out the negatives, and we began to print the areas underneath the stickers. So we began printing them, and then we started to kind of name them. So this was people in trouble, pushed to the ground. We gave them silly names, but it was very interesting printing these because we would lay them out on the floor, and the archive, the people that ran the archive were quite bothered by it. They were like, I know that person's forehead, it looks familiar to me, but I can't work out which picture it's from. And it felt a bit like we were offering a kind of new reading of this archive. It was like we had punched a hole right through it. And what's delightful to me about this is that the pictures are composed by the archivist who has stuck down this dot. And there's magic in that, and there's an accident in that. And one of the ingredients to our work is always the notion of chance. And I think when you work in a partnership with somebody, there is these accidents that happen. Because as a duo, you're not really the author of your work. I'm not the author, Adam's not the author. The author is somehow anonymous in a way. And so chance plays a big role in our practice. We also found in the same archive that some of the negatives had been marked by hand. And we asked them about this because it seemed quite brutal. Here you see a face obscured. Here's another example of that. And it turns out that people were able to come in from the street in Belfast and look at this archive. And it was a community archive, but of course a very highly contested collection of pictures. And many people, if they knew that they had been photographed, they were upset by that. They would come in and they would scrub themselves out. But it was a very symbolic gesture because the negative was always there underneath. But I think that attests to the power of photography. This is a milk riot. And there you can see the sticker is looming large over the surface. It's almost like what we were doing was thinking of a photograph in architectural terms. In architectural terms, you can look in plan at a building, but you can also look in elevation. So imagine turning a photograph on its side and looking at what's above it and what's in the middle and what's below it. So moving on swiftly, I'm going to talk about War Primer 2, which was mentioned by Judy. This is a project that we began, we started it many years before it actually saw the light of day. We had this book in our studio, and it's a beautiful book it's by Bertolt Brecht. It was published in 1955. Bertolt Brecht, as many of you I'm sure know, was a German playwright. But he was also very interested in photography, and he was quite concerned about photography. He was worried that photographs were a kind of hieroglyphics that needed to be decoded in some way. They needed to be demystified. And his solution to that was to write a poem. So he would collect newspaper clippings, and he would write a poem for each one, and he called these photo epigrams. So I'll read this one to you. Like one who dreams the road ahead is steep, I know the way fate has prescribed for us, that narrow way towards a precipice. Just follow, I can find it in my sleep. A cloud of smoke told us that they were here. They were the sons of fire, not of the light. They came from where? They came out of the darkness. Where did they go? Into eternal night. I'll read one more because they're so beautiful. And we put him up against a wall, a mother's son, a man like we had been, and shot him dead. Then to show you all what came of him, we photographed the scene. Yeah, so we took this book and we thought, how can we make the Hollywood sequel to this? How can we make War Primer 2? War Primer, a primer is a textbook. This is a book for kids to learn things in school. So this book, Brecht's original book, was intended as a series of lessons in how to look at photography. And I think he wanted to explain the pictures, but he also wanted to complicate them. And we began by, quite foolishly, by trying to write our own poems. And we did that for a while, but they were terrible. And we also went into the archives, or the newspaper archives, with a pair of scissors and started kind of cutting up bits of newspaper. But then we remembered a famous quote by Brecht where he said, "Don't start with the good old things, but the bad new ones." And that reminded us that we shouldn't be quite so nostalgic. And we put the scissors away, and we stopped writing bad poems. And we looked instead to the internet, because I think that's what he would have done. And I'm not saying that we typed his poems into the internet to see what we found. It was a little bit more nuanced than that. But essentially, what we wanted to try and do was find a relationship between a new set of images and his poems. And the words are so prescient that they do work in a remarkable way. Whereas Brecht's book was, of course, concerned with the Second World War, our book is concerned with the War on Terror. And it starts, of course, with the attacks in New York on the Trade Center. So if I read that again, a cloud of smoke told us that they were here. They were sons of fire, not of the light. They came from where? They came out of the darkness. Where did they go? Into eternal night. And I think it's important to say that this is a physical object, this book. There are 100 of them. We managed to buy the original books and stick these photographs into them by hand and screen print our names over Brecht's name and screen print the number 2 over his title. So it's a homage to the book, but it's also a kind of vandalism of it. And I quite like that. There's something a bit aggressive about it. There's not time really in this lecture to go through all of them, so I'm going to just skip through. I do want to say something about this, though. That's, of course, one of the famous pictures from Abu Ghraib, and one of the things we were worried about when we made this book was, well, we don't have permission for any of these pictures. We're just stealing them off the internet. And we wanted to use a number of these pictures from Abu Ghraib, and then we thought, well, who owns these pictures, actually? I mean, and we did a bit of research, and we found out that AP own them and are distributing them, and they are earning royalties from the reproduction of these images. And that just seemed both macabre and wrong, just absolutely wrong. I mean, if you think in legal terms, these pictures were taken by American soldiers, and therefore they actually belong to the American people. And we called AP and told them that we were doing a lecture. It was, I think it was Frieze Art Fair, and we had been invited to do a lecture. And we told them we were going to show this work, and they wanted £100 for us to show this picture. And we never did give them any money, and I think we owe them thousands now. But it's a bizarre thing. The other thing is, at the back of the book, Brecht put a list of all the links to all the pictures that he had collected, and many of them were from Life magazine, but they were from a wide variety of different newspapers. And so we also put the links, the web links to all of our pictures. This one came from www.Halloween costumes you shouldn't let your children wear, or something like that. That's Donald Rumsfeld riding a unicycle. And it's interesting, I'll read that one as well. Like one who dreams the road ahead is steep, I know the way fate has prescribed for us, the narrow way towards a precipice, just follow, I can find it in my sleep. So I'm going to run through the rest of these. And actually on the last page, what we did was Famously, there was a picture taken of Osama bin Laden's body after his compound was raided. And of course, that was the bookmarking the end of our book. And a picture was taken during the raid that has never been seen before. And it's been reported that this picture was of his body lying on the ground next to the body of an American soldier who, what had happened was they needed to identify his body. And because he was known to be 6'4", he was pretty tall, they wanted to measure his body. But nobody had brought a tape measure on, I think it was called Operation Neptune. So one of the soldiers who was known to be 6 foot lay down beside the body, and they took a photograph of that. And so that picture's been taken, and we don't know. Photographs are very slippery things, and they tend to get out eventually. But we just put a red triangle there, not triangle, sorry. What shape is that? And we just put that there to as a kind of, bookmark. And that led us on very kind of seamlessly to our next project. We were in the Brecht archive in Berlin, and the archivist there came to us and he said, I really want to show you this beautiful object. It's Brecht's Bible. Apparently when he was in exile in Denmark, and then he went to California, was living in San Francisco, and then LA, I think. He had a Bible, and he didn't use it for the scriptures. He used it as a notebook, and he would scribble on it, and he stuck a picture of a racing car on the cover, and that's really what drew us to this object. And there he stuck another picture in on the opening page. So Brecht's Bible inspired us to make our own illustrated Bible, which actually turned out to be quite difficult because in England, the Holy Bible, this King James version of the Bible, belongs to the Queen of England, and she has the copyright. So we had to go to her and ask her for permission to reprint the Bible, which took a long time again, and eventually we had a letter back from Cambridge Press to say that they would not seek to impede our project. So I'm waiting to hear from them still. And what we did was we read the Bible, and we tried to read it thinking about images in a way, about photography. Because photography as a project has a kind of biblical scale to it. Photography seems to want to capture every minutiae of human life. It wants to be there at birth. It wants to be there when we die. It wants to record our suffering. It's drawn to there's a kind of biblical scale to the whole thing. And we thought that the Bible would be a very interesting way of illustrating the story of photography. We went to an archive in London called the Archive of Modern Conflict, and they've been collecting images of war since the Crimean War to the present day. But they're a strange place, and they're kind of interested in everything. And we found all sorts of other types of images. Particularly, there was one box that we really liked that was full of magic tricks, like the one on the left there. So you can see that we've underlined things, and these underlined parts are kind of intended as captions for the photograph. So here on the right it says, "And he will be a wild man. His hand will be against every man, and every man against him." I can't actually read that, but this picture here on the right is a photograph of two young Nazi children sleeping on a train. And there were a lot of pictures like that, pictures that in a way are not acceptable to the narrative of the war and the story of the Nazis. There were many very personal photo albums by SS soldiers where you could see them saying goodbye to their wives and playing football behind enemy line and having a good time and joking and horsing around. And it was just a story about the Second War, about the SS soldiers that we'd never really been allowed to see. And actually these were pictures that had been rejected by a lot of other archives. So there we've underlined "In a dream by night," simply that. And the underlining is intended sometimes to explain the picture, a little bit like the war primer. Sometimes it's there to complicate it a little bit. Sometimes it's to demystify. The remnants of the giants. And they were left their images. And something we notice that throughout the whole of the Bible, there's one phrase that appears again and again, and that phrase is, and it came to pass. And we took that as it's like an interjection into the narrative. And it came to pass feels a bit like, tune into the next episode of Netflix, right? It feels like, and meanwhile, while that was happening, something else was happening. And the thing about reading the Bible is it's horrific, it's violent. And what we thought a lot about was why are we more upset about violent images than we are about violent words? And also about this notion of catastrophe. The Bible is full of catastrophe. It's a horror story. And again, drawing parallels with the history of photography. Photography is drawn to these sites of calamity and catastrophe. But the other side, the flip side of any catastrophe is a miracle. Somebody is killed in a tsunami, but somebody else survives it. And that person has, in a way, experienced a miracle. And so whenever we found these lines that said, and it came to pass, we took that as a kind of miracle and we put a picture of some kind of magic trick happening. How am I doing on time? 20 after. When do I have to stop? Whenever I want. Is anybody falling asleep out there? We can put the lights down a bit. So I think, as you can see, we're quite curious people, and we're slightly mischievous, and we're interested in photography and this medium, this strange medium that seems to be so ubiquitous. Everyone's got a camera now in their pocket, but it's also really quite a complex thing and quite a difficult beast in a way. And the story of Kodak and the relationship with race, I think, illustrates that really well. We get invited to very strange commissions every now and again. People who don't look at our website properly and think that it would be a good idea to invite us to do a commission. And we were contacted by the wife of the president of Gabon to come and photograph West Africa for her. Now, West Africa, Gabon is a very small but quite rich, oil-rich country that was controlled by Ali Bongo. It was controlled by Omar Bongo. He was the longest living dictator of Africa till he died about 5 years ago. And his son, Omar Bongo, took over control. And his wife decided that it would be lovely to make a kind of coffee table book of the jungles and this kind of thing. And they contacted us. So we thought, well, how can we either got to say no to this or we do something a bit subversive. And then we heard about a project, similar kind of project that Jean-Luc Godard did in Mozambique in the 70s. He was invited by Samora Machel, who had just won power from the Portuguese colonial ruling power, to come to Mozambique and create a television station. And he came there and he thought about it and he said, I can't shoot with film because Kodak film is racist. It's predicated on white skin. It's not very good at rendering dark skin. Just simple fact, it's racist. So he made this declaration. And it's quite interesting to think about film as racist. What I was saying earlier, the idea that a technology can somehow embody an ideology. And so we began looking at that and reading about that, and we decided to buy, well, first of all, we found that the history is so interesting. Kodak had a color film that wasn't very good at rendering dark skin, and then two of their main clients complained, the furniture industry and the confectionery industry. And they said, well, we can't photograph chocolate and we can't photograph wood. So they started to develop a film that was adequate for rendering brownness. And when they eventually got that right, they released it under this tagline, kind of piece of poetry as far as I'm concerned. They said, this film is good for photographing the details of a dark horse in low light. And it was a coded message to say that this was good for rendering dark skin. These are all the Shirleys. I can't go through everything, actually, so I'm just going to skip that. But so we decided to buy up all of the racist film that we could buy on the internet. So this is film from the 50s that hadn't been exposed. And we took it all to Gabon, and we spent a long time there photographing pygmies. We were deep in the rainforest shooting away. We attended some very secret rituals where the pygmies ingest iboga, which is a hallucinogenic root, and even the children eat it. And we took a lot of pictures. And then we got back and we tried to develop this film, and it turned out that actually this film couldn't be developed. People didn't have the ordinary chemistry to do it. And we found one really nerdy guy who knew how to do it, and he developed all of this film, and it turned out that only one frame from this entire group of film survived, and it was this one. And it's pink because the green pigment is less stable, apparently. And so that produces a very pink picture. So they were not happy at all with us. But it led us on to another story, and this is a bit how we work. One thing kind of leads to another. It's a bit like, an Aladdin's cave. And while we were, interested in this relationship between race and film and the history of color, we heard about the story of Polaroid in South Africa, which is fascinating. It turns out that it was discovered by an employee at Polaroid who was black and worked in the accounting department, a guy called Ken Williams. And he noticed that Polaroid was making a fortune selling equipment to South Africa. And him and his wife, or girlfriend, Caroline Hunter, who was a chemist and worked in the chemistry department at Polaroid, decided to investigate this. And they found that Polaroid was supplying the apartheid regime with a camera called the Polaroid ID2 that was used for making all of the passbook pictures in South Africa. And it was quite an ingenious thing. It was this kind of chunky camera made of plastic that had two lenses, and you could take a picture of a profile of somebody, then have them turn and look at the camera and take another one. You pull out the Polaroid, and both of these pictures are on one piece of film. So it was quite effective. It saved. You only had to take one picture. So this thing, we found out about these guys. This was their campaign, and they began campaigning for Polaroid to withdraw from South Africa. And eventually, they managed to get a team of executives from Polaroid to go to South Africa and find out what was going on. And they came back and they announced that they were going to withdraw from South Africa, that they were going to pull out against the apartheid regime. And it was actually the first international multinational to do that. And it was the beginning of the divestment movement in South Africa, where all of the big multinationals pulled out. And really it was those sanctions that crippled apartheid. So this was really a key moment in the history of South Africa. Here's the camera. We managed to buy one on eBay and repair it. And then we thought, well, let's take some pictures with it, but what shall we photograph? It felt like anything that we would photograph with this camera would be political in some way, let's say it would be toxic. And the camera came with an instruction manual, and it said, right, this camera is made for doing portraits. This camera must be held 1.2 meters from the subject. This camera has a button on the back called the boost button. The boost button is when you're photographing a black subject and you need more light, you press the boost button. So again, you see how a piece of technology is again in kind of embracing this ideology. We decided to make a series of photographs of plants, and we went on a road trip, and we disobeyed all the instruction manual. You know, we didn't photograph people. We didn't hold it in front of at the right distance. We didn't we pushed the boost button whenever we wanted to, but we didn't do it. We weren't photographing black skin, so we didn't need it. And you can see that the pictures are all split between this. Normally it would be a profile on one side and a portrait on the other. And why plants? It was two things really. We went on this trip, and it was a bit like a kind of road trip, a kind of love affair with our country, with the land, just enjoying it, trying to use the camera for something fun. But also plants are specimens, and this is a camera that was developed for photographing a particular kind of specimen. So I'm kind of coming to the end of things, and this is a project that we did in Russia. Again, we were invited stupidly by the main media organization, RIA Novosti, it was called. I think it's been closed now by Putin, to come to Russia and make a series of photographs. And they said that the theme of it was labor, and the purpose of the pictures was for an exhibition for the G20 summit in St. Petersburg. And we looked at this, and we've always been very interested in August Sander. He's a German photographer who photographed in the Weimar Republic between the wars. And he's always, in a way, one of the real big influences on us. We were always really amazed by the tenderness of his work. And really there's an incredible sense of melancholy when you look at the work of August Sander, and you realize that what happened later was the Nazis came to power, and they took some of these ideas and they turned them into something much darker. But August Sander was interested in classification of his society, but very much from a humanistic point of view. And he wanted to photograph the butcher and the baker. He wanted to photograph the philosopher and the revolutionary and the writer and the painter's wife. And we found out about this new surveillance system that had been developed in Russia, which was a very, very contemporary piece of technology that was now being rolled out across cities in Russia. And what it is it's cameras that are positioned all around the city, and they capture parts of your face as you move through the city. So you get up in the morning, you eat your breakfast, you go out the door, and the camera catches the right side of your face. You turn left, you go to the corner, and another camera gets another part of your face. And then the computer puts these bits together, creates a collage, which is essentially a kind of facsimile of your face. It's like a mask. It's kind of like a life mask in a way. And this life mask can be rotated in space, and it can be matched to a database. So we were really fascinated by this. And when we spoke to the engineers that developed this equipment, they explained to us that what they had invented was what they called non-collaborative portraiture. That was the term they came up with. It's a portrait that's made without the collaboration of the subject. And I think this brings everything really back to that first picture that I showed you of the woman who was under anesthetic. It's a portrait of someone, but the look in their eye is fictional. So you can turn this portrait to look at you, but it's not a real gaze. It's a fictional gaze. And we thought, well, how can we make a piece of work with this equipment? And we decided, let's reenact August Sander's life's work with this equipment, because August Sander is the great portrait artist of the 20th century. And this is a new era of portraiture in which the subject is no longer part of the collaboration. So we took the metadata of August Sander's work. We took the names, not even the names, just the categories. This woman is the painter's wife. And we actually cast these people for real in Russia on the streets of Moscow. So we found the wife of a painter. Here's some August Sander pictures. For those of you who don't know about him. This is actually somebody else called Helmar Lursky, who was a contemporary of August Sander. And so this is one of the members of the Pussy Riot group who has just been released from prison, and we photographed her. She was the revolutionary. This was a hiker. He was a school teacher. He was a carpenter. I don't remember what she was. But we basically photographed it was something like 300 portraits. And it was a very depressing experience because it wasn't like, you don't look in the camera and have your picture taken. All you do is enter a room. So the subject would be brought to us, they would come in the room, and then we would say, okay, that's it, goodbye. So it was a very depressing feeling. And that's how the work is shown. They're printed on fiber paper and then mounted behind glass. And that's just a small number of the total. I'm going to finish with a little poem that I've written for you. I went to do a number of studio visits today at Yale photography department and met 5 fantastic students. Really enjoyed meeting them and seeing their work. And I think in the corridor there's a piece of work scribbled on the wall. It says peanuts. Yeah, peanuts, peanuts. I don't know if anyone's seen that. Peanuts, John Cage was really interesting. He made a lot of works out of mushrooms, and he thought that you could learn a lot about music from studying fungi. So he made a lot of edible art. And we started this project years ago, basically sitting in bars, drinking too much, and messing around with toothpicks and peanuts. We would make these little sculptures. And we've started to collect the sculptures and kind of write a sort of history of our practice. I think there's a nice gap between what's in the image and what's in the word. And I think the photograph appears in your head on your own. There's a kind of gap. Shapes that remind me of you, of the many-gendered mothers of my heart, of the color that becomes a line that becomes language, of burning tires to scare snakes, shapes that remind me of the psychology of machines, of the future of images, of your periodic table, of a fire on the moon, of how to wrap 5 eggs, of the smell of gasoline that made the sight of the palm trees seem sad, of Brecht and Benjamin playing chess in Denmark, shapes that remind me of our fiction, and to bandage the knife, not the wound, of a smile that seemed to hurt your face, 3 pairs of shoes, 2 pairs of pants, 1,000 postage stamps, of the softness of spring grass, of how the white lines leaped ahead of us like a burning fuse, of loudspeakers yawning into the crowd, of mysterious alleys, lonely trees, shapes that remind me of our Jewish family album, of an umbrella opening up inside you, shapes that remind me of that the heart is a muscle, and that death always happens to other people, shapes that remind me of cool autumn, of the memory of fire, of getting high with you, of his disasters of war, of somewhere better than this place, of nowhere better than this place, of the heart which does not care which life it beats for, of you under the spell of your own hormones, of how you lied to me and lied to yourself in the park, shapes that remind me of a frozen chicken train wreck, of body horror, shapes that remind me of a man in trouble, of elephant soup, of being blinded by love, of how you turned me on and then you turned on me, of a fetus injection reflex, of 100 headless women, of a one-way song, shapes that remind me to whistle like Harpo Marx, of how every little girl loves daddy's shoes, shapes that remind me of you. Thank you very much. I'm not sure if any of you have any questions, or perhaps you just want to. We can also talk outside, maybe in the foyer. Maybe that would be better. Or does anybody have any burning questions?
Thank you. That was such a wonderful talk. So much of your work is really in dialogue or communicating or referencing the history of photography, and maybe it's too soon and maybe I just don't see it, but I don't see it in the new video piece. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the genesis of that piece, and perhaps you found photography inadequate for that task.
I think that's a really interesting question. There are other works of ours that I haven't included in the talk that I think connect more with that film. We did a project about 2 years ago where we went into and made a film about young cadets learning to become soldiers in England. And these cadets, they tend to come from quite poor backgrounds. And it's, in a way, it's kind of free childcare. You send your naughty kid to cadet camp, and it's pretty horrible. And they're very young teenagers, and they're learning to become soldiers. And they're learning to march, play the drums, tie up their shoelaces, that sort of thing. And we went down there, we took with us a woman who's an expert at playing the bouffon. We didn't tell them that we were bringing her. A bouffon is a kind of clown, a dark clown, whose job it is, I mean, in medieval times, the bouffon was invited into the court to ridicule the king. The bouffon was always allowed to really, ridicule the king, but if he went too far, he was beheaded. So it was a dangerous job. There's elements of slapstick as well. So we went to this camp, and we filmed them learning how to be soldiers. But at the end of each day, the kids would come and we would teach them. The bouffon would teach them how to unlearn being a soldier. So they would learn. A soldier must always stand with their eyes open and be vigilant. They were asked to stand in a room with their eyes closed. A soldier should always stand upright. The bouffon taught them how to fall over without hurting themselves. And we taught them a whole lot of all sorts of slapstick techniques. And eventually we were kicked out of the camp because they were like, this is not cadet stuff. But it's an interesting film because it's about what a lot of our work isn't necessarily about photography, but it's about the relationship of power and the authority of power, and the relationship between the authority, the institution, and the individual. And I think that's the thing that we're really interested in. And the bouffon in that film is this unruly, naughty character who refuses to be told what to do, and is absurd and is just defiant and standing up against authority, anti-establishment sort of character. And I see the digger, the singing digger, as a bit of a bouffon. She's a storyteller, and one of the things I forgot to tell you is that the song is a Sicilian song written in the turn of the century, and it's actually about the exodus of Sicilian men to America. So it's talking about migration. It's talking about disconnection from place. It's talking about homesickness and yearning for loved ones. All the same sentiment as those people in the boats. But of course, we're talking about a very different moment in history and a very different reason for, well, actually, probably quite similar reasons for migration. So the digger is violent, but at the same time quite tender. The digger is literally the machinery of the state, acting out the job of destroying the boats. And as I said before, destroying culture. But at the same time, she is singing, sadly, lamenting, and she's feeling a lot, and she's watching, and she's kind of helpless as well. And she also expresses something about the Mediterranean, which I relate to, which is that this is a place that we go on holiday to. It's like a kind of joyful place. We throw ourselves into the sea, and it's sublime, and we go water skiing, and it's a playground for us on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's a kind of a war zone. And so I think all of those tensions are there, and it may not be necessarily about photography, but it is about witnessing. And in that sense, I think it connects with a lot of our concerns. I'll call that a wrap. Okay.